Guys, since I'm in Idaho this week, I wanted to make sure that I provided some lecture to go along with the book and other resources for the class. So, Chapter 6, hopefully we got a chance to finish that on Monday. Since Wednesday, I will not physically be there on campus. This is your substitute teaching for Chapter 7. So we're going to talk primarily about lipids today. There's a little bit of discussion of some other macronutrients as it relates to fat substitutes, but for the most part, we're talking about lipids. So why do we like to have lipids in the diet? Why are they important? The biggest reason is going to be that they are a very dense source of energy. So to put it into context, when we talked about carbohydrates, we talk about glycogen storage, so taking excess carbohydrate and storing it in the muscles and in the liver for a rainy day, right? If our reserves are running low, if we haven't eaten in a while, we need to be able to pull out some carbohydrate out of storage and go ahead and use that. We have somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 calories worth of glycogen in our bodies at any given time. The majority of that is actually stored in the muscles, and so it's not available to all of the tissues of the body. It's really only available to the muscles. The liver is nice and generous, as I like to say, and it will share, but not a ton of energy to go around. It would be, a meal or, so worth of energy that you've got stored in there. So primarily the energy that we're using or dipping into when we're running low is actually coming from fat storage. So to put it in context, an adult male has somewhere around 100,000 calories worth of fat that can be accessed and used in times of need. Another reason that we really like fat is it's delicious. So it enhances the flavor of foods. It also provides what we call mouthfeel, which is that kind of creamy, almost like a texture or a feeling or sensation in the mouth when we eat foods that have fat in them. In addition to that, we've got kind of the satiety aspect. So it does delay gastric emptying when you eat fat. It is this tricky balance between, you don't want to eat too much fat because it takes up very little space. There's not a lot of volume there. And so a very high fat diet means that, for the same number of calories, you're getting a much smaller portion of food in terms of the weight of the food. However, you have to have some fat in order to really provide that satiety signal to make you feel fuller longer. And one of the ways that that happens is through slowing gastric emptying, keeping food in the stomach longer and preventing it from moving along through the GI tract through the other stages of digestion and absorption. So if we stay fuller longer, then maybe we end up eating less calories, and that's kind of the rationale there. Additionally, we have fat pads, so padding and insulation in the body. We can think of the insulation of our subcutaneous fat, so directly under the skin, and how that can help keep us warm and regulate body temperature. We also, as those of us who are biologically female, the amount of body fat percentage that we have really contributes to our ability to have a normal functioning reproductive cycle, normal menstruation, and normal childbirth and delivery and lactation and all of that if that's the path we choose. That being said, be aware and be cautious of the fact that restriction below a certain point of calories and resulting in a body fat percentage that is lower than biologically appropriate for a female body may and often does result in amenorrhea, so a lack of a menstrual cycle. And in addition to the reproductive implications of that, not having a person's period, not being able to actually become pregnant, there are additional concerns as well, and most notably, that comes down to bone density. So a lot of research has been done and continues to be done on individuals who have struggled with eating disorders and a much earlier and higher likelihood of developing osteoporosis in those folks. So something to be aware of professionally and personally. We also have fat that's insulating around various organs, so the kidneys get a nice little cushion of fat to help protect them from any jostles, bumps, or bruises. We use certain types of fats to make various hormones. So we'll talk more about this, but cholesterol, one of our classifications of lipids, can be used to make a lot of different kinds of hormones. So sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen also can be used to make vitamin D, can be used to make bile. So we've got lots of various biologically important molecules that are made out of various different kinds of lipids. The cell membranes themselves are primarily made up of phospholipids. That's one of our classifications we're going to talk about today. So really, really important that we have our fats that we are making in our bodies, and also the few that are considered essential and that we have to take in from the diet, because we need these things. A cell would not be a cell if you didn't have a membrane. And even within that cell, we've got organelles that are all membrane bound as well. So triglycerides, phospholipids, cholesterol, those are all extremely important in the cell membrane. We do have to take into consideration the fact that there are other lipid-soluble things that we need to be consuming. So vitamins A, D, E, and K are fat-soluble vitamins. And if we don't have enough fat in our diet, then we're going to have a harder time absorbing those particular nutrients and may even become deficient. That's kind of the overview on that. I am going to link this video, this little TED Ed. I want to say it's somewhere around 5 to 8 minutes long. Not super long, but a good summary of fats and their biological importance, and helps clear up some miscommunications of which kinds of fats are considered beneficial versus others. Now, to get into the nitty-gritty, we want to look at the chemistry of these molecules, because structure equals function in so many aspects of nutrition and metabolism, and fats and lipids are no different. So when we're talking about fats, the more scientifically appropriate terminology would be lipids, and lipids have the same chemical composition, with the exception of these phospholipids down here. They do have an additional element on the periodic table, and we'll get to that. But all fats, all lipids do contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. For the most part, they have a lot of carbon and hydrogen and very little oxygen, relative to other macronutrients. So that is kind of the biggest difference there, is that we've got lots of hydrogen, about twice as much as like a carbohydrate, for example. And we see that there's a lot of energy in fats. And when we look at the chemical structure, it's going to make sense why there is so much energy stored in fats. And part of that just has to do with the length of the chain, how many carbons are in that string of that fatty acid. And we start breaking it apart and liberating those and getting some energy that was previously stored between those bonds. So when we say that fats or lipids have 9 calories per gram as compared to, carbohydrates or proteins that have 4, the chemical structure is really why that happens. So we can break lipids into various categories. The simplest on this list is going to be fatty acids. So triglycerides and phospholipids, both of those have fatty acids in them. Triglycerides have 3 fatty acids, phospholipids have 2 fatty acids, as well as a phosphate group. So in the name phospholipid, that should be a clue that there is some phosphorus in there. A phosphate group is phosphorus and 4 oxygens. And when we look at the chemical structure of phospholipids, that will become more clear. Fatty acids, we'll look at those. Their chemical structure, as I mentioned, they are kind of the building block of triglycerides and phospholipids. And then we have these things called sterols, and sterols look very different than the other classifications of lipids. They are ring structures, mostly carbon and hydrogen, that are bound together. And again, we'll look at some of these cool graphics so you can see what those look like. So starting with that triglyceride, we've got the little rectangle around the left side there. And what it is surrounding is the glycerol molecule. So a glycerol is 3 carbons. You can see carbons denoted by these black dots here. And then you can also see hydrogens are denoted by these white dots in this graphic. The red is the oxygen. So you can see that the glycerol is one portion, Bound to that glycerol and kind of hiding in that top box is the oxygen that actually comes from the fatty acid portion. So I don't really love the way that they drew the box there because technically those two red dots belong to the fatty acid, and then they got bound to the glycerol. So when we look at fatty acids by themselves, it'll make a little bit more sense, but we have a carboxyl end and we have a methyl end. The carboxyl end is the end of the fatty acid that has the oxygens in it, and then the methyl end is all the way to the right-hand side, and that is what we consider the tail of the molecule. So a methyl group is going to be this carbon here bound to these hydrogens. So triglyceride, one glycerol backbone, three fatty acids. The majority of the calories that we get from fats and the majority of the fat that we ingest when we eat foods is in the form of triglycerides. So that's about 95% of what you're getting in your diet is going to look like this, triglycerides, 95% of the fats. Phospholipids look very similar in that they do have that glycerol. So you can see that on the left hand there. They have two of the fatty acids, and then they also have that phosphate group that I mentioned. So we've got, just to remind us, black for carbon, white for hydrogen, red for oxygen, and then this blue here is a phosphorus. And you'll also notice that some of these have two lines in them. So for example, the oxygen is bound twice to the same carbon. So that tells you a little bit about kind of whether or not you can add any extra hydrogens or kind of change the chemical structure there. We consider those double bonds vulnerable for attack in terms of borrowing, stealing electrons. So harkening back to your chemistry days, hopefully that is something that sounds slightly familiar to you. Phospholipids, because they have this phosphate group in them, they have an extra charge to them. For the most part, the reason lipids are considered lipids is because they hate water. So molecularly, chemically, they are built to really resist being around water. Charged things like other charged things. So water has positive and negative sides to it. And so it's going to want to hang out with other things that have positive and negative sides. So for example, if you take a water molecule and you want to put some sodium chloride next to it, the sodium it has a positive charge when it separates from the chloride. It's going to want to go hang out with the oxygen, and the chloride is going to want to hang out with kind of the hydrogen end, which is a little bit more positive because it's had its electrons kind of pulled away from it by the really electronegative oxygen side. And so hopefully that dipole is something that you remember. So that's what makes water such a great solvent and allows it to dissolve all sorts of things. Fats really only want to dissolve in other non-polar substances. So when we talk about digestion and absorption, it becomes really important to consider the polarity of the molecule that you're talking about. And triglycerides are nonpolar. They don't like to be around charged substances. They don't want to be around water. Whereas phosphate groups have this interesting ability to hang out with both substances at the same time. So we've got the part of the molecule that wants to hang out with fats, the part of the molecule that wants to hang out with waters, and that's what allows us to create that phospholipid bilayer as the cell membrane of all of our cells. So we'll look at a couple of other slides later that help to show us kind of that amphiphilic nature and that ability to hang out with both substances, but just kind of keeping in mind that this is what makes it biologically important in all living species, its ability to create these cell membranes, but it's also really important culinarily. So when we talk about emulsifiers in food products, we're talking about items that can play this role. So lecithin is something that you would find in egg yolks. You can also find in mustard. So there's various different compounds. Soy lecithin is another option that's widely used in food manufacturing. So it gives us that opportunity to kind of bring together substances that are fat soluble as well as substances that are water soluble. We don't get a lot of phospholipid in the diet, but we can make them in our bodies. So we are able to manufacture our own phospholipids, and no, it's not considered an essential nutrient because we're able to make it ourselves. So we do talk a lot about fatty acids because they are the building blocks of both phospholipids and triglycerides. So it's best to familiarize ourselves with the molecule and what it looks like. And as I mentioned, we have kind of a head and a tail. So the head of the molecule, the alpha side, is going to be this carboxylic acid side. So we have the last carbon in the chain that is going to be double bound to an oxygen as well as bound to an OH group. So we've got carbon, two bonds to the same oxygen, carbon, another bond over here to this oxygen, and then it's also bound to the next carbon in the chain because carbon likes to make four attachments. It likes to make four bonds. So we can count all of those bonds here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We also have the very end of the molecule, this side over here. It really hates water because it's all completely saturated with hydrogens. There's no additional charge here. We know that oxygen does like to carry a slightly negative charge. So this end of the fatty acid has a little bit of a negative charge to it. If a free fatty acid is floating around, then yes, this side of it will have a charge, this side of it will not. But often we're seeing these fatty acids as they are already bound to that glycerol molecule. And so at that point, that charge has already been absorbed by the next items that it's bound to. So we will look at important characteristics of these fatty acids. So one of the important characteristics is how long is this chain? Another important characteristic is, are there double bonds between the carbons of the molecule? We're going to ignore the other double bond over here to the oxygen. But when we are talking about saturated versus unsaturated, we're going to need to come back here and look at, okay, are there double bonds between the carbons? So ultimately, the types of lipids, fats that we eat in our diet, the types of fatty acids that we consume, do have a pretty strong link to our likelihood of developing certain chronic diseases, cardiovascular disease. So it is important to not just consider the amount of fat in your diet, but really important to consider the quality of fat in your diet. So there's that carboxyl end, as well as that methyl end, and kind of the lipid associating portion. So the part that likes water, the part that likes lipids. Saturated versus unsaturated. We can talk about saturated would have some double bonds in here, or sorry, saturated would have no double bonds in here because every single carbon is quote unquote saturated with the maximum number of hydrogens. Whereas our unsaturated, we're looking at how many double bonds does it have. So if it only has one double bond, we're calling it monounsaturated. There's no such thing as diunsaturated. We just skip that term. So anything including two or more double bonds between carbons in that fatty acid tail is considered polyunsaturated. Because if there are double bonds there, then we know that we could actually give it more hydrogens, but it just doesn't have the maximum number of hydrogens yet. We talked about the chain length being important, so we can consider short chain, medium chain, long chain, and very long chain. Those would be kind of the descriptors there that we use to determine chain length. And there are some differences in terms of digestion and absorption that relate to that as well. So short chain and medium chain don't need to go through the same rigorous process of digestion, transport via chylomicrons, and absorption. So for somebody with fat malabsorption, for example, if you've got somebody who's not absorbing fats very well, short or medium chain triglycerides would be, having a higher diet in those things might be something that you would consider for them. All right, so we want to know how full is our fatty acid. As I mentioned, saturated means it has all of the possible hydrogens that it could ever have because there are no double bonds in between those carbon molecules. We see that structure equals function by looking at how the shape of the molecule changes. Even if you just add one double bond, it completely changes the shape of that molecule. So now it has a little kink in it. It's not a straight line. And that means that it's harder for those molecules to get really cozied close up next to one another. This is why our monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids are liquid at room temperature. They have a hard time being super duper close together. Whereas with our saturated fats, they can sit one on top of another, and so they're going to be solid at room temperature. Hopefully we are aware at this point in our academic journey that saturated fats are more associated with negative health outcomes, and monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids tend to be better for human health. So if we look at those triglycerides, again, we've got our glycerol molecule on the top, we've got our fatty acid tails down the bottom. Solid fat is a triglyceride, and we know that it's solid fat because we've got completely saturated fatty acids here. You don't see any double bonds. You see how nice and straight those tails are in those fatty acids. Butter coming from cows would be one example of a food that's very high in saturated fats. Now, the reality on the ground is that all fats that we consume in our diet are going to be a mixture of various different kinds of fats. So even on the same glycerol molecule, you can have multiple different kinds of fatty acids attached. You could have two monounsaturated fats and one saturated fat on the same glycerol molecule. But we do look at the proportion of each kind of fat that is coming from various food products, and we will look at a chart later on that kind of shows us some examples of that. So even something like olive oil has some amount of saturated fat in it, and even something like butter has some amount of unsaturated fat in it. So just to kind of keep those things in mind. For the majority of foods, animal-based foods are going to have higher amounts of saturated fat. Plant-based foods are going to have higher amounts of mono and polyunsaturated fats, so just in general, unsaturated fats. But there are a few exceptions. So coconut oil and palm oil both tend to have lots of saturated fatty acids. There is mixed evidence on coconut oil in terms of the health implications of that. Part of that may have to do with chain length. Some of the types of fatty acids that are found in coconut oil tend to be shorter or medium chained, even if they are saturated, and that may have different health implications versus saturated fatty acids that are long chain. Palm oil, we know for a fact, tends to be pretty bad for human health. It's also not so great for the environment and for the political stability of the areas where we tend to harvest that palm oil. So for multiple reasons, best to avoid. With regard to this other triglyceride here that we're looking at, we have our glycerol at the top, and you can see that we have some double bonds in here because you can see this carbon is double attached to the next carbon. That means that it doesn't have a hydrogen here or here. So we have two blank spots for those hydrogens, and it's creating a little kink in the tail there. You can see a couple of different points of unsaturation, and so it's creating a different shape than if we had a fully saturated fatty acid. As I mentioned, the majority of unsaturated fatty acids are coming from plant foods. And here is, as promised, that chart that shows us different sources of food. So for example, canola oil, the red there is going to be the amount of saturated fat found in canola oil, the amount of monounsaturated fat found in canola oil, the amount of linoleic acid, which is one of our polyunsaturated fatty acids, meaning it has multiple double bonds, so it's also unsaturated, as well as the alpha-linolenic acid there. So we will talk more about omegas in our next section, but linoleic is an omega-6 and linolenic, alpha-linolenic acid is an omega-3. So you can look at some commonly used oils and look at the proportion that's coming from saturated versus other kinds of fats there in that cute little infographic. And that's it for section 1. We'll move on to the next video with section 2.